Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to share some dimensional floral cards using the Into the Meadow collection from Spellbinders. This first die here is the Lavender Mountain Daisy. Then we have the Milkweed Die, and I'm not going to be using this die the way it shows on the front of the picture. I'm going to be using it to create a different flower. And then we have the Painted Daisy. I love that Painted Daisy. It's nice and large. It reminds me of Gerbera daisies, and I'm using that as inspiration. Then we have a beautiful 3D embossing folder. This one's called Wildly Beautiful. And I love the fact that with these dies and that embossing folder, you can create some really large cards, from 5x7 cards if you want, or you can scale it down and do some A2 cards. So I'm going to do some A2 cards. I regularly do the A2. It's one of my favorite sizes. So to start off with, for my first card, I'm going to be using that Painted Daisy die set. I'm starting off by using that 3D embossing folder, and I'm embossing it onto a piece of A2 sized white cardstock for the front of my card. Once it's embossed, I'll trim it down for the front of my card when I'm ready to put them together. I'm using some Hero Arts, or mostly Hero Arts cardstock today. This first color that I have the daisies die cut from is called Plum, and I'm ink blending the centers of the flowers with some Wilted Violet Distress ink. I just want to create an area that's got a little bit of shading in the center of the florals. I also want to brighten that center up a little bit, so I'm going to use some Lisa Horton solid gold ink and just do a little bit of ink blending in the center. I plan on using the little die flowers that go in the center of the flower, and I have them die cut out of some Beeswax Cardstock, but I wanted a little bit of gold shimmer underneath that. To add a little bit more gold to my card, I'm using it lightly on my embossed background, mainly on the two larger florals, but I'm putting it lightly on some of the other areas as well. I'm not trying to use too much ink. I just want a hint of that gold. I don't really want it overpowering the whole card, but I just thought it would be a great way to highlight that background. You could always use this background as is, and then not necessarily with that gold ink blending on it, but with just a sentiment. That background is just so beautiful. For the leaves, I have them die cut out of some Pesto cardstock, and I'm ink blending it with some crushed olive distress ink. I'm going to trim my embossed background. Every single one of my cards for this video have the outer mat, or the colored mat, cut to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. And then the inner mat, the white area, is cut to 3 7/8 by 5 1/8. So we have a larger outline around the edge of the card, and then the colored mat is a little bit smaller. I wanted to try to keep as much room as possible for those dimensional florals. Because these florals are so dimensional, these are the type of cards that I would tend to just hand to someone. It wouldn't be necessarily something that I would mail. You certainly could if you wanted to, but I would then choose, say, a bubble or a padded envelope, and possibly some small foam pop dots, just to give those petals a little bit of support while they're in an envelope. Now, to shape my petals, I'm using the flower shaping kit. I have a nice foam block here from that kit, and I'm using the larger stylus, just kind of going in a circular motion on each one of the petals to curve them. Then I flip that flower over and do it in the center on the front side, just to give a little bit of a divot to the center of the front of the flower. I'm going to do the same thing on all of my flower petals, or all of my flowers here. Now, I cut 2 of the large ones and only 1 of the small one. When you look at the die sets, it tells you exactly how many of each one to cut. And for this particular one, it did say 2 of the small one. I chose to do just 1, because I knew it was going to be full enough anyways for the look that I was wanting. If you want it to be fuller, you can absolutely do a second one and have the center flowers doubled up as well. For the leaves, I'm using that same stylus, and I just went over 2 of them. I tend to prefer to use my fingers sometimes with the leaves. It's just a little bit quicker, and it saves using an extra tool. I do like using a stylus for especially larger flower petals when I want them to be especially curved. Often I will just use my fingers just as something really, really quick. For the inside flowers, they're really tiny star-shaped flowers. So all I'm going to do is put them on my foam mat here and use the tiny stylus from the flower shaping kit and just press in. And it's going to give that flower automatic shape there, but just by pressing that in. You can use a circular motion if you want to, but because there are so many flowers there, I was trying to do it in a way that was a little bit quicker, and in my opinion, just pressing it in, you get a very similar shape. Now, to glue these to the center, the flower center, I'm using my reverse tweezers to hold them, putting a dot of glue on the back, and then placing them in the flower center. And I tend to go and do the outer edge first and then fill in the center part. Now, after doing this for a while, I was getting a little bit of glue on my tweezers. So every once in a while in the video, you'll see that my tweezers want to stick to the tiny flowers that I'm using. So what I end up doing, rather than using my finger on my left hand to press that flower down, is I found that it worked really well to use a die pick to just press in the center of that flower. It presses that flower with the glue down, and it's a little bit more secure than just using my finger to hold it down. So that's another idea of a way to do this. As I'm progressing through the video, especially when we get to the last one, I change up my strategy just a little bit more because I want there to be a little bit more glue for my flowers to stick to. So I am going to completely fill in the center of these flowers. Now because I put that gold ink underneath there, I'm not necessarily worried about completely covering that flower center and not seeing any of that plum cardstock through there, because I can see that gold underneath there, and I like the look of the gold there with that beeswax cardstock. So all I'm doing is trying to get the dimension of those florals there, not necessarily trying to cover the entire thing. You can see that because I have all those little pieces already shaped, it does come together for the center of the flower quite easily, but this is definitely a card where it's a labor of love. Like, you wouldn't be doing 100 of these cards because it would take a long time, or if you did do them, you would definitely be pacing yourself. This is one of those cards, in my opinion, that I would just do for someone that I knew was going to really appreciate it, that say loved these types of flowers and was going to save it. Again, you wouldn't be doing this for someone that you knew didn't appreciate your cards. Now, because I'm only doing an A2 card here, I thought one flower was plenty. I think you could fit 2 on an A2 card, but definitely 3 would be too much. I glued it to my embossed background, pressing it in place with that die pick to make sure that that glue has some good contact with my card base, and then I'm tucking in my leaves. Now, I typically like to tuck in my leaves after I've placed my flower down. It just gives me an easier way or an easier visual of exactly where I think the leaves should go. You could, if you wanted, glue your leaves to the flower ahead of time. This is just what works for me, so it may not work for everyone. The other thing that I typically will do is when I have my leaves there, I won't have them all sticking out the same amount. Some will be sticking out a little bit more, some a little bit less, just depending on the look that I'm going for. So once I have that flower down and the leaves glued down, I'm taking a little bit of Glisten stickles and adding a dot in the centers of each one of those beeswax little flowers in the center. It's just going to give it a little bit of extra texture as well as a little bit of sparkle. Now, the Glisten stickles is translucent, so you see a little bit of that gold glitter, but you also see the color of the cardstock underneath there. If you wanted it to be a little bit more opaque, you could choose a more opaque stickles like gold or platinum. I just wanted that texture and that sparkle. Now, to give my sentiments or my cards some sentiments, I am using the Nature's Botanical Garden sentiments. This is from a previous collection from Spellbinders and Susan Tierney, who is the designer of these flower dies as well as many other floral dies. These sentiments are perfect for floral cards, so I just figured they'd worked best or worked well with these cards. So I chose 3 that I wanted to use for these cards. I'm going to ink them with Versamark ink and then emboss them with some gold embossing powder. I plan on having gold touches on every single one of my cards, so the gold embossing or the gold embossed sentiments are going to work well for that. I'm just doing this on some Hammermill cardstock. It doesn't need to be anything thick because I'm not necessarily going for the pressed dimension from the letterpress. I'm only going for a pressed and embossed sentiment. So I like to use super fine embossing powder when I'm using press plates for my sentiments, especially because when you're pressing that pattern in, sometimes there's really, really tiny areas, and I just find that the super fine embossing powder sticks just a little bit better. Once I have that on my cardstock there, and I did use some embossing powder tool before pressing my sentiments there just to make sure that that powder was only going to stick to my Versamark ink, I can tap off the excess, put it in the container, and then use my embossing tool to melt that sentiment. I love that these sentiments have coordinating die sets to them. So once my sentiment is heat embossed, I can match up the coordinating dies. I do like to tape it in place with some Best Ever craft tape just to make sure that it's not going to move on me while I am doing my die cutting, and then I can die cut the sentiments. Now I'm just doing them and using them as is. If you wanted to give them extra dimension, you can use some scrap cardstock and die cut a couple scrap pieces and glue that behind there if you wanted to add that dimension to your sentiments. For the look that I'm going for here, my dimension is more in my embossed background as well as my florals, so I don't really feel like I need to add that dimension to it, but it's certainly an option if you wanted to do that. So once I have my sentiment ready here, I'm going to put some Barely Art glue on the back and glue that down to my card. I like using the liquid glue for most things, and especially for this when I'm putting florals together, because it gives you a little bit of wiggle time to move things around, making sure that they're placed exactly where you want them to go. For my next card, I'm using the Lavender Mountain Daisy, and I'm going to create 3 flowers here. I have them die cut out of some Passion Flower Hero Arts cardstock. This is a light purple. And then I have my greenery die cut from some Kiwi cardstock. You could use the same Pesto cardstock from the previous card, but when I'm creating lighter colored flowers, I prefer to do lighter colored greenery with it. I'm still using that crushed olive distress ink to ink blend on my leaves there, but I'm not re-inking that ink blending brush. I just used what was left over on that tool so that it wasn't quite as dark. For on the flowers here, I'm using some shaded lilac distress ink, just adding a little bit of dimension to the center of the flower. I like when you ink blend on florals because it just gives you that visual dimension, and I think it just gives it a little bit of extra detail. I think it just looks a little bit nicer. You certainly don't have to if that's not your cup of tea, but I just love the way that it looks. So with my flowers done, I can start to shape them. So I'm taking that same tool that I used for the first flower, doing it quickly on each one of these petals for the flowers. When I do this shaping, sometimes you have to be in the mood for it. So I liked doing it for the first flower, but when it came to the second flower, I was just in a mood to use my fingers. So I just used my fingers for it. Now, keep in mind that when you use your fingers for the ink or for the shaping, it's not quite as detailed. You don't get quite as much of that shaping as you do when you're using an embossing tool. There's definitely a deeper and more dimension to it when you use a shaping tool like the stylus. But it just depends on the look that you're going for, really. Because I'm using several flowers here, I just like the look of doing it with my fingers. It went a little bit faster, so it just really works. Whatever works for the look that you're going for. Now, when I'm putting these 2 flowers on top of each other, this is the same flower die that I cut 6 times to create three flowers. I want to make sure that I don't have the same petals over top of each other. So typically I will match up where the petals are, and then I'll twist it like a 90-degree turn, or a little bit more than that, just so that all my flowers aren't exactly the same. But by twisting it and changing it and making sure they're not in exactly the same spot, I'm going to get 3 completely different flowers. Now the florals for the center of this flower are very similar in shape to the first one. Each one has their own die, but they're very similar in shape. So I shaped them off screen in exactly the same way that I did my first card. Placing them in the center of this flower, obviously because this flower is smaller, there's less florals there, it needs less to it, but I did the same process. I used my tweezers to hold the small flower, but this time I added the glue to the center of the flower first. So I just put the flower into the glue, used my die pick to press it in place, and it just went a lot quicker. For the background for this particular card, I'm going to use the Norwegian Rose Mailing embossing folder. This is another one from a previous Spellbinders and Lisa Cherny collection. I think it might be from the same one that the sentiments were from, but it just is another perfect embossed background for florals. So I just did that background over my A2 piece of white cardstock. Again, now that that is done, I'm going to trim it. The nice thing about trimming it afterwards is I can pick and choose exactly what part I want trimmed out. I do it afterwards because I find that if I cut down my cardstock before time, often when it embosses, it just kind of skews the shape of it. So by doing it afterwards, I can make sure that I have the exact size that I'm wanting for my card. To add a little bit of gold detail to this background, I'm doing a little bit of splatter. I'm using the watercolor mixing set. I added a little bit of water to that tray and then used my Yasutomo brush just to mix that all together and splatter that over my background. I let that dry for a few minutes off screen. Once it was totally dry, I decided to start assembling my card. So I have another piece of that passion flower cardstock here. You can see that I die cut my florals out of it. I think I did that for the first card as well. This is one of the ways that I like to extend my cardstock. Because this is being covered by another layer on top, and because my cardstock is thick enough, you will never know that I use that cardstock to also die cut some of my flowers. It's also going to be covered by some of those florals in the front. So why not use those mats to make your cardstock go just a little bit farther? This is especially helpful for specialty cardstocks, metallic cardstocks. Those cardstocks are even more costly than some plain cardstocks. So by doing that, you can just extend your cardstock a little bit further, make it go a little bit farther. Once I have my embossed piece on there, I'm ready to add my sentiment as well as my flowers. Now I'm putting a little bit of glue on there, and then I still use my die pick just to press that in place, make sure that that glue has good contact with both the flower as well as the background. While doing that, one of my small florals came off because I hadn't waited long enough for that to dry. So I just glued that on there as well. After those florals are on there, I can put my leaves there. And here's another instance where you can see how it makes sense to put the leaves on afterwards. I wanted to make sure that I had some of the leaves going a little bit over my sentiment piece, but not totally over it. So by doing this afterwards, I can position those leaves exactly where I think they should go and make sure that they are not covering my sentiment. While placing these leaves, most of the time I'll do single leaves, but every once in a while I will add a second leaf just to give it a little bit more visual interest. I just like the way it looks. Again, it's not something that you have to do if you don't like that look, but I just think it looks a little bit more interesting if some of the leaves are single and some are a little bit clustered. Once I add as many leaves as I want, I will let that dry completely. Now, when I'm doing this, I typically will have extra die cut. So I already have some extra of those centerpieces. I have extra leaves. I will save those extra pieces and put them in a Ziploc bag and just store them with that die set so that so that next time I'm using that die set, I already have those pieces done, ready to go, and I can possibly use them for that. For my third card, I'm using the Milkweed die. And like I said at the beginning of the video, I don't plan on using it to create that milkweed. What I plan on using it to do is create some hyacinth. Those are one of my favorite spring flowers. And I thought the milkweed for cards was going to be a little bit two-dimensional with it sticking out. So I thought hyacinth would work well for these flower shapes. There are two different tiny flower dies there. There's one that looks kind of like a plus sign and one that looks a little bit more like a flower, a 5-petaled flower or a star. So I have two colors that I've die cut here. One is that passion flower, which is the purple that is in my craft stacks. The other one is Azalea cardstock. They are both going to be ink blended with Wilted Violet Distress ink. For my passion flower, I didn't take any of those flowers out of the cardstock. So the easiest way to ink blend them is while it's still in that cardstock, using a detailed ink blending brush and then popping them all out. For the passion flower ones, the light purple ones, they were already popped out. So I put them on my sticky mat. It does take a little bit longer to put them on the sticky mat, but it makes it a lot easier to do this ink blending. I'm also not trying to create perfect ink blending. I have some flowers where the ink is darker, some where the ink is lighter. I will do, say, 2, 3, 4 flowers, just depending on how much ink is on my brush, and then I will re-ink my brush. I like the look of it better when there's a variation in the ink, when it's not completely covered with the ink, or when they're not exactly the same amount of the ink. Once that's done, I can ink blend on my leaves here. And I did show it earlier, but I just really realized I forgot to say it. For the stems for these, I'm using the stems from the Cymbidium Orchid die set. This is another one from a previous release. I just wanted a stem to create the hyacinth with. These are a little bit thicker than what I normally would like, but I didn't really want to use the pieces from this Milkweed die set. It just didn't work for the look that I was going for. So the orchids have the closest thing to it. For this particular card, I have a passion flower mat, or not passion flower, azalea mat, as well as white cardstock, but I also wanted to bring in these Perfect Touch arch dies. They have a little detail around the edge of them that I really like, and I thought they would work well for this particular card. So I die cut the smaller one, out of some Hammermill cardstock, this one here out of the passion flower cardstock, and I just like the look of it. It's going to go well with the flowers that I'm creating. Once again, with this particular one, the azalea one here, you can see that I die cut my flowers out of the center of the cardstock, making it go a little bit farther. Again, it's just a great way to stretch that cardstock and make it go a little bit farther. I'm going to glue that down, and I always put an acrylic block when I'm gluing mats down just because it helps to hold everything nice and flat. It frees up my hands for my next layer, and when you're placing things or trying to plan things out, because the acrylic block is clear, you can easily do that over top of your card base and see exactly what it's going to look like on that card base, and then easily move that design to the side. Next, I'm going to put my stems for my hyacinth. Now I want to put my stems down, but I also want to put some of the leaves down when it gets time to that. So I decided I should probably get my flowers assembled ahead of time. I shaped them exactly the same way as the little tiny yellow flowers for my first two cards. These flowers are just a tiny little bit bigger, but I didn't think they needed any more dimension than that for the look that I was going for. This die set has two different shaped flowers, like I said before. One is more of a plus sign, one is a little bit more of a 5-petaled flower sign or flower shape. So what I did off screen, because it takes a long time to do it and it would be a little bit repetitive and monotonous, was I took the 4-petaled one, or the star-shaped one, or the plus sign one for the bottom, and then glued a 5-petal flower one for the inside piece. So I have a double layer in there, and it's just going to give a little bit more dimension to these flowers. So next I glued the stems as well as some of the leaves. I want some of the leaves in the background to go behind my flowers. And then I put glue onto that stem fairly liberally in kind of a long, tall triangle shape. So I have a thinner line at the top, a thicker line at the bottom. I wanted to make sure that I could make my flowers a little bit thicker towards the bottom, very similar to the shape of the hyacinth. By starting at the top, I can control it a little bit better, and I'm also using my tweezers just to help push those flowers or put those flowers down. Here I didn't grab my die pick to put them down. I figured I had enough glue on there. I was liberal enough with my glue that I didn't necessarily need it. Again, I also have extra flowers from these. I could go down just a tiny little bit farther, but I didn't want to cluster my flowers too much. Once I have the shape that I like and I'm happy with it, I can let that completely dry and work on my next batch of flowers. So doing these flowers were absolutely perfect for creating hyacinth. So it's a great way to use your dies in a way that they weren't necessarily intended. Like this die set, obviously when you look at the milkweed, it wasn't necessarily intended to create a hyacinth, but it works really, really well for it. The only thing that it needed that it didn't already have was the stems. So I highly encourage you to look at your dies, think of different ways that they can be used, different shapes that you can create with them, because it makes your dies a little bit more valuable when you can do several things with them. So I'm repeating that same process with the passion flower, little flowers here. Again, these ones I also created off screen and assembled off screen. And off screen as well, when they were assembled, I added just a dot of that Glisten stickles to it to give it that little bit of extra texture, a little bit of extra sparkle, and let that totally dry before assembling it here. It makes the assembly process go so much quicker when you have them already assembled and ready to go. It does make it a little bit tedious when you're assembling those flowers because they definitely are a labor of love, but the final result is so worth it. The dimension that you get from these is really satisfying when you're putting them together. And the assembly, obviously, as you can tell, is much easier to put together when these flowers are already assembled, ready to go. This would take a lot longer to assemble if I were to, at this point, be putting down the little plus sign flower, plus putting the 5-petal flower shape in it, and then working on the next one. So by having those flowers already assembled, ready to go down, it makes it really, really easy to put together. So once I have the look that I'm going for, as many flowers as I want, I have a few more leaves that I can put towards the front. These ones can go a little bit over top of those flowers. When I'm putting these leaves down, these ones I'm only gluing the bottom part of the leaf so that they have a little bit of dimension to them. I didn't shape it anymore with my fingers. You certainly could if you wanted them to come out a little bit more. Again, I want the focus to be on those florals. I don't necessarily want the focus to be on the leaves. Once I have as many leaves as I want on there, I can glue down my sentiment. Now, because I have a little bit of dimension there or layers there with those stems at the bottom, I put my sentiment down, and then I did put my acrylic block on there just to hold it down while it was drying to make sure that it dried nice and flat on there. So here is the finished result. I love how the hyacinth turned out, and I think it looks really, really good with that arch dye as a mat. It suits it really well. Then we have our second one done with that Lavender Mountain Daisy. This is such a pretty one. You can do it with whatever color you want. Again, it reminds me of just a Gerber daisy or just a daisy. So I think you can have fun with the colors there. This one here, the painted daisy, you can do it the same as the front of the package and get really fun with your ink blending, or create a Gerber daisy with it like I have done there. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.